Most people think governments hide things because the truth would cause panic. That's not accurate. Panic fades. What they fear is something much worse than panic. They fear a shift in perspective that cannot be reversed. I didn't break my silence because I suddenly became brave. I broke it because I realized the silence itself was part of the system. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former United States Air Force. I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a strategist, and I definitely wasn't one of the men who made the decisions. I was the kind of man the system prefers: reliable, quiet, capable of following instructions without asking what they were protecting. For years I believed I was serving my country. Now I'm not sure what we were really serving. The first thing you need to understand is this: most operations connected to unidentified aerial phenomena don't look like the movies. No flashing alarms, no dramatic discoveries, just paperwork, controlled access doors, and men who speak very little. And one word repeated again and again: containment. Not investigation, containment. That difference took me years to understand. My assignment began in the early 2000s. I was transferred quietly from a conventional logistics role to a task group that technically didn't exist. The paperwork was minimal: no mission statement, no operational description, just a designation code and instructions that our unit would be supporting recovery monitoring. That phrase didn't make sense at the time. Recovery monitoring, not recovery. Monitoring. I asked my immediate superior what exactly that meant. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Your job is to make sure other people don't recover what we failed to. That was the first time I understood we were not always first, and that was something I had never even considered. Most Americans grow up believing the United States leads every technological race, but inside the system, there was always a quieter fear. The fear that someone else might stumble onto something first, or worse, that they already had. The incident that changed everything for our unit didn't happen in the United States. It happened thousands of miles away, in a desert most Americans couldn't find on a map. Northern China, remote, dry. Satellite coverage was good enough to observe large disturbances, but not precise enough to identify what caused them. And that's where the story actually begins. We first heard about it through an internal briefing that was deliberately vague. An object had entered Earth's atmosphere, trajectory unknown, origin unknown, impact confirmed, but not in American territory, and not in any region where the United States could legally intervene. That alone was enough to change the tone of the room, because impact locations matter, a lot. When something unidentified crashes inside U.S. territory, there's a protocol: recovery teams, containment units, scientific analysis groups, layered secrecy. But when it lands somewhere else, you're no longer the one collecting the evidence, you're the one watching someone else collect it. And that is a very uncomfortable position. Satellite images began arriving a few days later, blurry at first, then sharper. A disturbance zone in the desert, roughly circular, almost like a scar carved into the ground. Chinese military vehicles appeared within 48 hours. That part wasn't surprising. What was surprising was how fast they moved, faster than we expected, faster than our analysts thought was possible, which led to the first uncomfortable question: how did they know where to go? The briefing room changed after that. Conversations became quieter. Less speculation, more caution. Because there are only two possibilities when a nation arrives that quickly at an unknown crash site. Either they were extremely lucky, or they were already looking. That was the moment the words I would hear for years began appearing in internal reports. Recovered object. Not debris. Not wreckage. Object. My role in the operation wasn't glamorous. I handled data coordination between observation units and intelligence teams, satellite timing, signal logs, movement tracking. It sounds boring, and most of the time it was. until the day we received the thermal scans. Thermal imaging reveals things normal cameras miss: heat signatures, energy patterns, structural anomalies. When those images came in, the room went quiet, not the casual silence of people concentrating, the heavy silence of people realizing something didn't behave the way it should. Because the object in that desert was still warm, days after the impact, and not in the way wreckage should be warm. Metal cools quickly in open desert air. Anyone with basic physics training knows that. But this object was different. The heat wasn't fading outward from a central point. It was distributed evenly, as if something inside was maintaining it. Someone in the room finally said what everyone else was thinking, very quietly. That shouldn't be happening. No one answered. No one needed to. Because the real question wasn't about temperature. The real question was something much harder to say out loud. What exactly had China just recovered? And how long would it take them to understand what they were looking at? That question stayed in the room long after the screens went dark. And it's the same question I've been carrying for more than 20 years. Because the truth is, the United States wasn't just watching China recover something unknown. We were watching them recover something we recognized. And that realization changed the entire tone of the mission. But what disturbed the analysts the most wasn't the object itself. It was the shape of the impact site. Because it didn't look like a crash. It looked like something had tried to land and failed. So let me ask you something. If something not built by human hands attempted to land on this planet, and one government reached it first, what exactly do you think they found buried under that desert sand? There's a strange kind of frustration that comes from watching history happen and knowing you're not allowed to touch it. That's what the next weeks felt like. We were observing something we couldn't reach, couldn't interfere with, and couldn't officially acknowledge. China had sealed the entire region within 72 hours. Satellite images showed perimeter expansion in phases. First a standard military containment ring, then a second one. The third perimeter appeared 5 days later. That one told us everything. Because the third perimeter wasn't built for defense, it was built for secrecy. When countries secure a crash site, they usually focus on debris recovery. But this looked different. The Chinese military wasn't collecting scattered fragments across a wide area. They were focusing almost entirely on a single central point. Heavy excavation vehicles arrived. Large containment tents appeared over the impact zone. And then something that made our analysts lean closer to the screens. Cooling equipment. Industrial-scale cooling units. In the middle of a desert. Think about that for a moment. A crash object that stayed warm for days, and the first equipment brought to the site was designed to reduce temperature. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone on their side had seen the same thermal data we had, or worse, they already knew what kind of object it was. That possibility made people in Washington very uncomfortable, because if China already had prior knowledge of the technology, then this wasn't just a recovery event. It was a race we didn't know we were running. My job during those weeks was to help coordinate observation schedules. Different satellites pass over specific regions at different times. If you line them up correctly, you can build a near-continuous picture of activity on the ground. That's what we did. Frame by frame, movement by movement, truck by truck. You start to see patterns that way, and patterns tell stories. The story unfolding in that desert was methodical, careful, almost cautious. Chinese teams were not behaving like people dealing with wreckage. They were behaving like people dealing with something intact. Excavation progressed slowly, not because they lacked equipment, but because they were avoiding direct mechanical contact with the central structure. We could see that clearly. They dug around it. They exposed edges gradually. And when the shape began emerging through the sand, the room went quiet again. It wasn't jagged. It wasn't fragmented. It wasn't twisted like aircraft wreckage normally is. The outline was smooth, curved, almost deliberate. One analyst zoomed in and whispered something I'll never forget. That thing didn't break apart. He was right. Whatever had struck that desert had survived the impact mostly intact. Now imagine the strategic implications of that. A craft built with materials unknown to modern engineering, recovered in near complete form inside the territory of a geopolitical rival. That isn't just a scientific event. That's a technological earthquake. Inside the Air Force chain of command, conversations began shifting tone. The language changed. Early reports called it an unknown object. Later reports started using a different phrase, non-conventional vehicle. Eventually another term appeared in internal summaries, a term no one said out loud in the room, but everyone read. Non-human origin suspected. I remember staring at that phrase on a screen for a long time, because phrases like that aren't written casually. They pass through layers of review. People argue over every word. If it survived the approval process, it meant something serious. It meant the analysts had run out of conventional explanations. But what disturbed our leadership most wasn't the craft itself. It was how quickly the Chinese teams adapted their handling procedures. Within a week, the excavation stopped entirely. Instead, large structural frames were assembled around the object. Hydraulic lifting systems were brought in, carefully aligned. And then one morning, during a satellite pass, we saw it move. Not far, only a few meters, but enough to confirm something critical. The object was not fused to the ground. It was resting there, almost like something placed gently on the desert surface. And that raised a possibility no one in the room wanted to discuss. What if the impact we detected wasn't actually a crash? What if it was a controlled descent that failed at the last moment? Because the crater didn't look violent enough for something traveling at orbital speed. There was no widespread debris field, no explosive scatter pattern, just a deep indentation and a craft sitting inside it. I remember one of the intelligence officers leaning back in his chair and saying something that stuck with me. If that thing came down under control, then it didn't arrive here by accident. Nobody responded, but the thought stayed there in the room, heavy, uncomfortable. Then came the part that changed the entire operation. 3 weeks after the impact, the Chinese military shut down all visible activity at the site. No trucks, no excavation, no visible personnel. Just an empty desert scar where the craft had been. Which meant only one thing. They had moved it. But the real question wasn't where they took it. The real question was something far more unsettling. How did they move something they had never seen before? Something built with materials they didn't understand. Something that remained warm long after impact, without triggering a catastrophic reaction. Because inside our internal briefings, one possibility was quietly circulating. A possibility that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with ownership. What if the craft wasn't abandoned wreckage? What if it wasn't dead technology waiting to be dissected? What if it was something else entirely? Something that had simply stopped working, for now. That idea never made it into the official reports, but it stayed in the room, lingering like smoke after a fire. Because if that craft had ever been operational, then someone, or something, built it. And if one government on Earth now possessed that machine, then the balance of technological power on this planet had just shifted, quietly, permanently. And almost no one outside a handful of classified rooms even knew it happened. But the most unsettling part of the entire situation came months later, when analysts began comparing that Chinese recovery event to something that had happened decades earlier inside the United States. Something the public still argues about. Something most people believe was just a myth. But inside the system, it was never treated like a myth at all. And that comparison raised a question that still keeps me awake sometimes. Because if the United States once recovered something similar, and China now has their own version of it, then how many of these craft have actually reached Earth? And more importantly, why do they keep ending up here? There is a moment in some classified briefings when the room stops being a place for analysis and quietly becomes a place for realization. I remember exactly when that happened. It was late in the evening. Most of the building was empty. Only a handful of us were still inside the observation unit, reviewing comparison reports connected to the Chinese recovery. Up to that point, the working assumption had been simple. China had recovered something unusual, maybe extraordinary, but still a one-time event, an anomaly, something rare. That idea didn't survive the next set of documents. One of the analysts pulled up an archival file from the late 1940s, not the one you're thinking of, not the one that gets mentioned in documentaries. This was a separate report, internal, never discussed publicly. It described a desert recovery operation conducted by the United States decades ago. Remote terrain, minimal debris, object largely intact. Reading it felt uncomfortable, because the similarities were too precise to ignore. Location, isolated desert region. Impact pattern, shallow ground penetration. Heat signature detected hours after descent. Structural integrity, largely preserved. When we placed the Chinese recovery data next to that report, the overlap was impossible to dismiss. Same pattern, same characteristics, same strange absence of violent destruction. That's when the conversation in the room changed. Because if two nearly identical events had happened 70 years apart, then the idea of randomness became harder to defend. One of the senior intelligence officers leaned forward and said something very calmly. "We may not be looking at crashes." No one laughed, no one argued, because everyone in that room had already considered it, quietly. Crashes create chaos, debris fields, scattered wreckage, explosive dispersal. But both events, the one decades ago and the one in China, showed something different. Controlled descent, structural preservation, localized impact zones. Almost as if the craft had attempted to land under emergency conditions. That possibility raised questions nobody wanted written in an official report. If these craft were attempting controlled landings, then they weren't random visitors. They were navigating, choosing trajectories, approaching the planet deliberately. And sometimes, something went wrong. The deeper analysts dug into historical data, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. Because isolated recovery events weren't limited to two countries. There were whispers of others: South America, Central Asia, even parts of Africa. Most never confirmed publicly, most buried under decades of classification. But inside the intelligence community, the idea was never dismissed. Objects had reached Earth before, and occasionally, one didn't leave. That realization changed how the Chinese recovery was interpreted. It was no longer viewed as a rare accident. It was seen as another entry in a much older pattern. And patterns make governments nervous, because patterns imply intent. I remember going back to the thermal images from the desert in China, studying them again. Something about the heat distribution kept bothering me. It wasn't just uniform, it was stable, consistent, for days, almost like a system running in standby mode. That detail triggered another classified reference, one connected to the earlier American recovery. According to that file, the object recovered decades ago had shown residual energy activity long after it was retrieved. Not explosive, not dangerous, just active, like a machine waiting for something. If that report was accurate, and the Chinese craft showed similar behavior, then we weren't looking at dead wreckage. We were looking at disabled technology. There's a difference, a huge one. Because dead machines don't restart, disabled ones sometimes do. The thought that another nation might possess something like that created quiet panic inside certain defense circles. Not public panic, strategic panic. Because whoever understood that technology first would gain something far beyond conventional weapons. Not just better aircraft, not just faster propulsion, but an entirely different understanding of physics. And once that door opens, you can't close it again. I often wonder what the Chinese engineers thought when they finally examined that craft up close, when the sand was cleared away, when the surface became visible, when they realized the material wasn't any alloy listed in human engineering databases. Because according to the briefings we saw, the surface showed no seams, no rivets, no visible joints, just a continuous structure, like it had grown that way. One analyst compared it to something biological, not alive, but constructed with the same smooth continuity you see in natural systems. That comparison was removed from the final report, but the original notes stayed in the draft files. Months after the object disappeared from the desert site, Chinese research facilities began expanding rapidly in a specific region. New laboratories, restricted airspace, heavy security. Officially, it was all described as aerospace development, but inside intelligence circles, everyone knew what the expansion was connected to: the recovered craft. And that's when a different kind of conversation began quietly spreading inside the U.S. defense structure. A conversation that wasn't about what China had recovered. It was about what we had already recovered long before them. Because once analysts confirmed the pattern, another question emerged. A question I had never considered during my years following orders. If governments have been recovering these craft for decades, why has none of that technology appeared in public aerospace programs? Why haven't we seen revolutionary propulsion systems, or materials that defy known physics? Where did that knowledge go? The official answer was always the same. Research takes time. But inside the system, some people suspected a darker possibility, that the technology wasn't simply advanced, it was incompatible. Not something human engineering could easily replicate, not something our physics could even fully interpret. That thought stayed with me long after I left the service. Because if China recovered a craft they couldn't understand, and the United States recovered something similar decades earlier, then both nations might be sitting on machines built by an intelligence neither of them truly comprehends. And if that's true, then the real secret isn't just that these craft exist. The real secret is something far more unsettling. Despite decades of possession, despite unlimited research budgets, despite the smartest scientists on Earth studying them, humanity might still have no idea how they work. But the most disturbing question came from a junior analyst one night. A quiet guy, didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He stared at the recovery images for a long time and then said something very softly. If these things are trying to land here, and failing, he paused, then finished the thought. How many others landed successfully? No one in the room answered, because that question didn't belong in any official report. And maybe that's exactly why it's the one I've never been able to forget. But there was one detail about the Chinese recovery that almost no one talks about. A detail buried deep inside the sensor logs. Something detected shortly before the craft disappeared from the desert. Something that suggested the machine may not have been as lifeless as everyone assumed. And when that signal appeared on the monitoring screens, for the first time during the entire operation, the room became truly afraid. Most people assume fear in the military comes from enemy weapons, missiles, aircraft, things you can see coming. But the most unsettling fear I ever witnessed didn't come from a weapon. It came from a signal. Quiet, brief, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. And it appeared at the worst possible moment. By the time it happened, the Chinese recovery operation had already ended. The craft had been removed from the desert site. Satellite passes showed nothing but disturbed sand and abandoned excavation structures. Officially, the event was over. Our monitoring teams were preparing to redirect observation resources elsewhere. But before that happened, we conducted one last sweep of sensor logs. Standard procedure. Nothing dramatic, just making sure no anomalies had been missed. That's when the signal appeared. It was detected by one of our orbital monitoring platforms. Not a communication satellite, a different kind. The kind designed to detect unusual electromagnetic activity across large regions of the planet. Most of the time, those sensors pick up harmless things: lightning storms, solar interference, occasionally military radar systems. But this signal didn't match any known pattern. Short, clean, precise. And it originated from the exact coordinates where the object had been recovered in the Chinese desert. Except the craft was already gone, removed days earlier, which meant the signal hadn't come from the crash site itself. It came from the object while it was being transported. The data analyst replayed the recording several times. Each time the same pattern appeared, a narrow burst across multiple frequencies, not random noise, not atmospheric interference, structured, deliberate, almost like a pulse. Someone in the room asked a question that changed the entire mood of the briefing. Was it a transmission or a response? That distinction mattered more than most people realize, because transmissions imply intention, responses imply communication. No one answered immediately. Instead, the signal analysis team ran it through comparison databases: military communications, civilian satellites, astronomical sources. Nothing matched. The pattern wasn't human, at least not any human system we knew about. The burst had another unusual property. It appeared simultaneously across several orbital detection platforms, positioned thousands of miles apart, which meant the signal wasn't directed. It was omnidirectional, broadcast outward in every direction. One analyst summarized it in a single sentence: if that craft sent the signal, it wasn't calling China. The room went silent, because that left only one other possibility.